Today we keep the feast of St. Francis. And one of the reasons I chose to make this Sunday about St. Francis is, besides being a saint I have a great personal devotion to, my middle name is Francis. My father's middle name is Francis. My son's middle name is Francis. It's not because we have a great devotion to Francis, it's that because it's a family name. But also, I think he's a saint that speaks very powerfully to our modern age, and is probably one of the most popular saints in today. It has become tradition over the last few years that St. Francis is the day for the blessing of the animals, which is a service I've organized on numerous occasions, and I think it's a wonderful service because we are in an age where a lot of people are emotionally dependent upon their pets, where they have a great affection for them and want them to somehow be seen as being affirmed by the church. And the blessing of animals is a beautiful service. But I'm a bit hesitant about tying it to Francis. I know that Francis has this tradition of being kind to animals, but I think his theology, his prayer life was far deeper than that. And I think it can become quite shallow if we just think about him loving animals. His critique of what it meant to be human and what it meant to be part of on our place in the order of the universe was far more radical and far deeper. He understood that we were part of creation, and creation was important because creation bore the marks of the Creator, God, and that all creation was somehow tied up in the work of God. And therefore, we as human beings couldn't be just proud in our own species, as it were. We had to see ourselves as being part of God's great creation, maybe in a special place because of certain gifts we've been given, but we are part of creation, and all creation bears the marks and praises God. But my sermon originally was going to be about, but as I began to reflect and think about Francis more during the week, I began to realize that actually perhaps what is most radical about him and most important for us and most challenging for us as modern day Christians is not what he said, not what he did, but who he was. And maybe that's one of the great challenges as we as Christians have, is to move from the idea of what do we do as Christians to what are we as Christians. I think it's significant that the current Pope, although a Jesuit, chose to take the name Francis. If you understand church history and certain traditions within the Catholic Church and that, it's a quite radical thing for a Jesuit to take that name. When he was elected, I said to various people, I'm not sure that he will make that many changes to doctrine or church policy or anything like that, but I do think that who he is and how he chooses to live and chooses to be a pope will be radically challenging. And I think that's been true. Now, if you know the history of Francis, you know that at a certain point in his life, he was in a very difficult situation, and many people critique him as having dealt with it very badly. He really did face what was evil, and if probably by sins of omission, i.e. sins of what he did not do, he ended up cooperating with that evil and failing to challenge it. But I also see a man who perhaps has reflected upon that, and I think he has reflected upon that, and realized the sin he committed. And he came to God, and I think he found in God both healing and forgiveness. And I think that healing and forgiveness radically changed him to a different human being with a different set of priorities. And one of the things he learnt with his own sinfulness, his own failings, was a sense of humility, a sense that his place in God's creation is not of the great power and authority, but a place of a child of God who is loved by him, and brings him to a place of being very humble and down to earth and very aware of his own weaknesses, his own shortcomings, his own failings, and his own need of God. I think that was seen in the very first days when he just, as becoming Pope, he didn't become the prince. He remained the common man with new responsibilities. He chose not to live in the palace, but in a pilgrim's hostel. He chooses not to travel in luxurious cars, but in simple, ordinary day cars. One time, I think we really saw who he was when he was touring the United States, and he was invited to eat lunch with Congress, the seat of power, the most powerful people in the United States and perhaps some of the most powerful people in the world. And he chose instead to go and have lunch at a homeless shelter with the homeless. That is where the church was supposed to be. That who needed the Pope. That's where he was called to be. I was reminded of a bishop I knew, a bishop who was very significant in my own life, who on Christmas would go to one of the big churches, the cathedral, one of the big churches in the diocese, to celebrate midnight mass, and then on Christmas Day would make his way around to all the prisons in his diocese, celebrating Christmas communion with the inmates. Now, some might say that the bishop should have been with good Christians because they deserve to have him. I think he would have probably answered, I go to the prisons because that's where I'm needed. I'm also reminded of Johnny Cash when he was recording his record at Folsom Prison. And one of the producers, one of the record executives, suggested that his normal fan base, which was made up of good Christians, might object to him singing to a bunch of criminals. And Johnny Cash's response was, if they're good Christians, they will understand exactly why I'm singing to criminals. So that sense of humility, and I think that is what we find in Francis, that sense of humbleness, that sense of their complete dependence upon God, that sense of that God will fulfill all our needs because he is the only one who is capable of it. Francis' own story was he came from a very wealthy family, a very powerful family, a very influential family. And he, I think as a young man, reveled in that. He went off to war dressed in his finery, convinced of his courage and his sophistication and his abilities. He came back a broken man. And he realized that all that he had depended on in his life, his wealth, his position, his personality, was nothing, and that it could not bring him what he needed. So he stripped himself of all that physically, literally, in the town square, stripped himself naked and took on the clothes of a beggar and became aware of his complete dependence upon God. And I think that humility, that sense of the need of God, that sense of his closeness to God because that's the only place he could find what he needed, was what made him so attractive. Obviously, there was something about him that drew people to him, and people respected him. One of the most poignant moments in his life, as I talked about in the introduction, is when he went to pilgrimage to talk to the Muslims and was actually invited into the Sultan's camp. They must have seen something in him that realized he was a man of peace, a man who was not there to fight them, but there to talk to them. They must have understood that deep in his heart there was his love that shone throughout his life. The Franciscans continue to be aware of their need of the complete dependence on God. If you're an Anglican Franciscan, if you wish to join the order as a first order, which is the people who live the life of poverty, obedience, and chastity, you are asked to give all your wealth away, not to the order, not to the Franciscans, but to some other charity. So you come in with nothing. The order itself only keeps at most 6 months reserves in at any time because they are dependent upon God. At the end of a financial year, if they have a surplus, they give it away. They don't save it. They don't squirrel it away in case of a rainy day, because with God, there is no rainy day. God will call them and give them what they need, as much or as little. I remember visiting some Franciscans, and perhaps this tells us about how what could be seen as a life-denying, fun-denying way of life is actually not. I visited one Franciscans who were working in a very poor area, living in that area, doing what they could, proclaiming Christ, preaching through their being there, preaching through their love, preaching through their work and support of the people in the community they work in. And one of the Franciscan brothers was a great fan of Star Wars. He loved Star Wars. And a new Star Wars movie was coming. And of the money, little bit of a pocket money, I think it was like less than £10 a week he was given, he was saving up a little bit each week so he could afford to go to the pictures and see the new Star Wars movie. When he went, it was an event for him. It was something very special because he had saved and he had worked towards it. For most of us, going to the pictures, it's just something we do. We pay our money, we don't think about how much the cost is, and we go in and watch the movie. But for him, it was a major event. It was something to give joy and to understand the pleasure of life. And I think that's what about Francis is really most important. That although he lived a life of humility, a life of poverty, he yet had a rich life, a full life. Recently in one of the newspapers, I'm not sure which, it suggested that, especially for older people, that it was important at this time to go walking, but not just walking for exercise. The psychologist was saying what was more important as we walked, we were to look at the world and notice the trees, glorifying nature, the flowers and the sun and the rain and whatever we're walking through, to really engage ourselves with it so we see its beauty, its fullness, and fill our lives with joy. I think that's very Franciscan. That sense of it's not, poverty doesn't, and humility doesn't stop us from enjoying the world. That if we have the right orientation, that if we understand that everything comes from God and that we are part of God's creation and that he loves us and wants to give us joy and peace and happiness, and all around us the flowers and the birds and the animals are singing God's praises, that brings us not a true poverty, but true wealth. And quite often we are so caught up in our material things, in our possessions, in our positions, that we fail to see the true wealth that God is throwing about us. So Francis is that one who calls us back to God, back to the Creator, back to the fullness of life, back to peace, back to joy. And we can give thanks to God for his example and pray that we may learn the lesson.